the international flavor continues to rise, and the IMF has revised global growth projections downwards to 2.8%. While India's GDP projection has also been revised to 5.9% versus China's at 5.2%. What are the risks that could derail India's growth? That's something that I want to ask my next guest on the show. Of course, this is Sanjeev Sanyal, who's joining us live right now. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you so much for taking out time and being with us. Help us understand this new IMF projection. How is it that there's a downward sort of reduction in growth to 2.8%, while of course India is going to in all likelihood outshine China? How do you see this?
So it's not surprising that there are lots of global economic headwinds right now. Some of them come from the war in Ukraine, tensions in East Asia, and of course there is the lagged impact of various measures taken during the COVID pandemic, which of course, as you will remember, we here in India had warned the West about. So the net result of this is that expectations are now that growth will slow down, and that's what various multilateral agencies are also now forecasting, that global growth is now going to significantly slow down. Of course, it also means that it constrains India's growth as well. My own sense is that India's economy will grow, as the economic survey pointed out, it's somewhere in the range of 6.5%. That's slightly higher than what the IMF projects, but in the range of what most of the others project. My argument would be that, look, under these circumstances, this is a decent rate of growth. We can grow faster than this in the sense that unlike in the past, our infrastructure, our banking system and our financial capabilities and so on would be able to sustain growth much higher, maybe even at 8%. But in an environment where our export markets are going to be actually slowing down. In fact, as you may know, that the expectation is that the UK and Germany are actually going to see 0 to negative growth, and growth in the US and other places also going to come down quite substantially. In that situation, when your export markets are slowing down, it is not a good idea to try and force growth ever faster, because what will happen is that when you grow faster, your imports will grow, but your ability to export to other countries will be constrained. So what will happen is that your current account will suddenly blow up. So given that context, I would argue that we should not try to force growth beyond this 6.5% type range, simply because it would unnecessarily jeopardize our macroeconomic stability.
Okay.
For the time being, 6.5 is a good rate of growth, and there will be a time when global conditions will stabilize and we will be able to push it up to the 8-9% range, but never jeopardize macroeconomic stability to force growth for any short period. That is one of the lessons of economic history, and maintaining stability is absolutely critical, and I think the Reserve Bank has been correctly responding to this situation as it has evolved.
Right. So, of course, the Reserve Bank stance has been vindicated, as you would have just seen the numbers, Sanjeev. But we are sort of talking to you now in the context of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in Washington in the US. And I want to understand from you, she's, of course, like in India, even internationally, India's G20 presidency is really being talked about at multiple forums. So specifically on the economic front, how relevant do you think is India's G20 presidency to tide over issues such as, oil prices that we were talking about earlier, the banking crisis, free trade agreements, FDI, etc.? Because all these, of course, will have a very direct impact on India's economy.
The G20 looks at various long-term broader issues, and of course maintaining financial stability in the world is an issue that the G20 and specifically the Framework Working Group looks at. There are also groups on international financial architecture and so on. But the key here is that as the presidency of the G20, of course, we will bring many of these topics for debate I personally think that an important issue that needs to be brought to debate is relates to financial stability and
Yeah, we'll come to that.
the stop-go impact of global, particularly Fed monetary policy on the impact on emerging markets. I think this is an issue that India should bring up. Also, I think we should bring up the issue of OPEC intervening, in my view at least, prematurely in the oil market, because when the world is slowing down, you do need commodity prices to come off in order to ease the pressure. And I think oil prices should be allowed to adjust downwards when the world economy is slowing down, because that would be part of the market process. Therefore, interfering with it, in my view, is wrong. Now, whether or not that should be a G20 issue is something for the India's political leadership to decide.
Of course. So, Finance Minister earlier today, India time, maybe last night, US time, had also spent some time with the IMF's first Deputy MD, Geeta Gopinath. And the two of them really talked about how India should be insulated in the global debt crisis. So talk to us a little more. You also touched upon it, when you spoke about financial stability. So talk to us a little more about the global debt crisis and how insulated is India really, in your opinion?
So what is the main problem globally is the following, is that during the COVID period, many countries around the world, specifically the US, UK, European countries, went out there and splurged both on the monetary side and on the fiscal side. And this caused both larger indebtedness, as well as it meant that all kinds of bubbles and dislocations turned up in the financial system. Now, not surprisingly, and we had warned repeatedly this is what happened, inflation got stoked. So global inflation went spiking up. It is now at the highest level seen in a couple of generations in most of these countries. And so something had to be done. So you now have the monetary authorities in all these countries tightening in order to try and squeeze inflation out. Now the problem is that when you do this, there is a limit to how far you can take this if you are also not doing a fiscal correction at the same time. Because you opened both the fiscal and monetary gates out, but then when you tightened, you more or less only relied on the monetary side, whereas the fiscal side has only allowed for some natural correction to happen. You haven't actually tightened on the fiscal side. There are many reasons for this, political or otherwise. That is not what I want to get into. But the point is, if you rely too much on just one of those and not on the other, the financial system is telling you that you have reached the limit of it.
Right.
And so therefore, you now have a situation where either these countries have to accept inflation, or they have to be willing to cause further damage to their financial systems by keep tightening, or at some point what I think is the most reasonable thing to do is to go back and revisit some of their fiscal policies, which may be painful to do when you're having to actually doing fiscal correction in the middle of an inflationary spiral. Obviously it's a difficult thing to do, but that's precisely why macroeconomics is difficult. That's why you don't go out there and splurge irresponsibly when you have an economic shock.
Of course. So, of course, Sanjeev, the data has just come in. You spoke about inflation in the US. The data has just come in. It's grown 5% in the month of March as opposed to 6% in the month of February. So obviously, the monetary tightening in the US has also, it seems to have at least worked, but we let that be sort of, the problem of the US, even if it has an indirect impact with us. I want to stay with you a little longer on the finance minister and her visits, on the business side in the US as of course, yesterday you must have seen last night, the finance minister has said that India's economy is transparent, open and watchable. Of course, she said this in a bid to invite bilateral and multilateral trade with India. And at the same time, Indian business leaders in Washington are also talking to their Western counterparts, saying that any growth plan minus India is practically a non-starter. So, is this an optimistic point of view, or do you see this as core reality today?
I think it's widely accepted that India will be an important, if not already is an important part of the global trading system, and that role is growing. Our role certainly in the services trade world is already well established. It is in goods trade that we have not, I think, pulled our weight, and I think that is something we are trying to correct by inserting ourselves in multiple ways into the global supply chain. There's an area where we are succeeding, for example, in electronics and smartphones and so on, where you've seen Apple, for example, move a lot of its production to India.
Right.
But there are other areas
retail
as well
stores
that we need to insert ourselves. We have a large area in for example, generics, pharmaceuticals, where we are a global leader, and we can continue to build on that.
Right.
And there are other areas, special steels and other areas where we should also pull our weight. So I think there is no question in my mind that whether from a technological perspective, a demographic perspective, a geopolitical perspective, or even a global supply chain resilience perspective, India has to be an important part of the global economy into the future.
You mentioned our success in electronics. So talk to us specifically about mobile manufacturing success in India. So according to you, what has India done right exactly on the front of mobile manufacturing?
So there are many things that meant that smartphone manufacturing has taken off in India. One is obviously we have a large market, so that gives us an advantage. And of course, GST created a common market that made it further easier. So already there was some minimum cluster domestic market that you can leverage. Secondly, of course, more recently we have been encouraging using the PLI schemes, for example, to creating clustering here, and also improvements in infrastructure, whether the ports and airports, which are used for both bringing in inputs and flying out the output. Both of them have improved over time. So this is an area which we have obviously doing well in. But we can use the same experience to spread into other areas as well.
Okay, but when you talk about manufacturing and especially electronics manufacturing, you can't have that conversation without really taking China into account. So finally, do you think we are now a little closer really to finding our competitive advantage over China in the mobile manufacturing space specifically?
No, I mean, there is no question that China is far ahead of us right now. But there are areas where we can compete, and we will put in our best effort to do so. Do remember that for the time being, China is both an important trading partner and a competitor. And there are areas where they will vacate, we can move into those areas, and there are areas where we can compete with them. I don't think we should simply assume that we cannot compete with China. There are areas where we can compete with China, and we should to try and do it. But at the same time, we should not wish China away. China is there, and it is a formidable economic player with whom we have no choice but to engage.
Okay, so since you specifically spoke about China being an equal trade partner as well as a competitor, the finance minister yesterday also spoke, if I'm not mistaken, this was at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and she cited that there's a fine balance between what we call Atmanirbhar, self-reliance, and price arbitrage. Now this, of course, with the focus on producing goods in India as a priority, but India being open to import as well, where we get better price economics. So which are these goods where importing is better than manufacturing for India?
So there are many areas where we will export, many areas we will import. It's difficult to give a sort of list, because this is not a static list, it keeps evolving. So I think first of all, having a static view of the matter is in itself a wrong way of looking at it. There are many areas where the trade will be in the same area. We may be importing in the same sector, we may be importing some things and exporting some other parts. So I think this is an evolving thing in which we need to have a dynamic system of being able to monitor it. Where, for example, we want to provide PLI schemes, we need to do that. Where tariffs need to be changed, or internal GST or infrastructure needs to be built, it's something that needs to be dynamically judged. I think the whole idea of doing it in a static way in itself is wrong.